Today, we're improving some commander decks, including our own personal decks, hoping that these failed decks can be salvaged.
I'm Mia, and all of my lands hurt me.
I'm Beezy. I play way too many Baubles, and if your deck needs help, you can get on this show where we are both going to improve your commander decks, just like Relictus and Blitzflix, who have joined over on Patreon. So head over there if that's something that you want.
We're also sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can buy singles, doubles, triples, precons, and sealed product, and all of the other cards that you might need for your decks. If you want to make improvements, you should buy from Card Kingdom and then use our link. Tell them we sent you because it really helps out the channel.
Great place to get Innistrad Remastered and pretty soon Aether Drift product. Just saying. We're also sponsored by Dragon Shield. Best sleeves in the multiverse. Good sleeves. If you use the code NERDS at checkout, you save 5% on your order.
We're also sponsored by Mockfield, but not now, a lot later, or maybe very soon. Who knows? You'll see. But today we are going to be reviewing a bunch of decks, including our own, and we are going to be making changes for them and detailing why we are doing that.
We're going to be reviewing notes written by the deck creator, making 10 cuts, 10 adds, and giving you a little bit of statistics to wrap everything up in a nice bow as we review things. The first deck review we have is from our patron, Blitzflix. This is Marchesa the Black Rose. She is 1 black, blue, red for a 3/3 with Dethrone, and other creatures you control also have Dethrone. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step.
Marchesa is a very scary commander, and for good reason too. This deck wants to use sack outlets and counters on creatures to rebuy them for tons of advantage, and Marchesa is one of the best commanders to be able to do that.
Yeah, Blitzflix did note, specifically for his deck, that he might not have the right ratio of fodder to payoffs to recursion and that whole engine, and he wants to keep it under a $400 budget. That's not going to be a problem. Nitpicking nerds excel on a budget. It's not going to be a deal. One thing I wanted to point out that we do like looking at for decks is the average number of lands in the opening hand. And in this case, it's 2.69. And I just thought that was a pretty solid rate. I think that's a pretty solid place to start. And we didn't really feel like we needed to change it too much, especially since the optimal start for this deck is to play turns 1 through 3 with fodder or ramp and a sack outlet into turn 3 and 4 Marchesa. So when Marchesa comes out, you already have a sack outlet and some creature that will die, come back with a counter, and thus giving you reusable Marchesa activations.
Blitzflix also wanted to mention that we didn't want to put any super staples into this deck while also keeping it under budget, unless those super staples were very synergistic to the game's actual plan. So we wanted to keep that in mind, but first we're going to go to the cuts.
There's a first batch of cuts that we wanted to make, and they all go together, and I'll explain them in a second. We have Thalicos Seer, Mark of Mutiny, Drana, Liberator of Malakir, Alesha, who laughs at fate, and Sage of Fables. These are all cards that do undeniably work with Marchesa the Black Rose. But if we're looking at what Blitzflix's initial problems were, it's that he's having trouble getting off the ground with that initial first 5 turns of, I have fodder, I have a sack outlet, it's going to have a counter on it, and now I can rebuy it to even just something simple. Draw a card every turn because of Marchesa's ability. So I think all of these cards, while they do work with Marchesa, they stand out to me as not enabling you, not being part of your preferred draw, and they're instead something you play after all of this stuff when you already have the setup. But the struggle we're trying to have is we want the setup.
Honestly, the thing that takes a deck from an okay deck to a great deck is those first few turns. I feel like a great deck can't take those first few turns off or just stay stagnant in there, because those are the turns where everyone might be just kind of dawdling, and if you're ramping during those first few turns, then you're going to be ramping way ahead of about everyone throughout the entire game.
Yeah, and this isn't just us having some kind of CEDH mindset. This deck already had 10 1-drops and 12 or whatever 2-drops. This deck just wants to get on board early. And these cards, I think, pay you off after, but they don't actually help make sure you have that stable foundation to abuse over and over when you have sacrificing and looping creatures. Now, this next batch of cuts is consisting of Surveilling Sprite, Purple Crystal Crab, and Oculus. They are all the definition of fodder. They're just 2-mana dorks that when they die, you draw a card. And that's exactly the kind of card that Marchesa Black Rose wants, because you want counters, sacrifice, and one of these dudes, and then you can just loop it every single turn with Marchesa. So in the case of Oculus, I can sacrifice it and have it return every single turn, which is 4 times. That's drawing 4 cards, presumably for no mana, since I have a free sack outlet, and that's cool. But I think we are giving up a little bit of advantage, especially in these critical early turns, by cards that say when they die. And we are going to tell you in the ads section that we're going to put cards that say when they enter, you draw a card. So now, if I don't have every piece, or I'm still looking for looking for the cards to make my first couple turns really sing and really hum along, I get that first card right away, and it sort of saves me time.
I definitely think that's a big tempo swing when you're looking at something like Dusk Legion Zealot versus Purple Crystal Crab. It's more of like if Marchesa gets countered or you can't find that sack outlet or you can't get it to stick, then you just have this thing sitting around and you're like, oh gee, I hope something big swings at me so I can die and so I can get my card. I really hate waiting for that, so being able to get it immediately is really important to your game plan.
Yeah, the next card is Gravelighter, and this is an interesting one. The deck has a lot of these Fleshbag Marauder type effects. These are super, super good with Marchesa, especially if your Fleshbag Marauder can have a counter put on it. Then you just do that every turn, and I don't know how you're supposed to beat that unless you figure out an answer to the sack outlet that they have. But with Gravelighter, it says if a creature died, you draw a card. Otherwise, you get the Fleshbag Marauder effect. But this is in the fodder category. We want to sacrifice it and loop it. But if we do that, we don't get the Fleshbag Marauder thing. So I thought this was kind of weird. If it's just a card that says draw a card like the Oculuses of the world, then I feel like it's a little overpriced at 3 mana.
For our last cut too, we also cut a swamp. In general, we can just do more with those land slots and we have a better land to put in.
So for the ads to replace some of those Oculus type cards that we cut, we're going to add Fibblethip, the Lost, and Clattering Augur. These are both cards that just say when they enter, you draw a card right away. I think that's just not strictly better, but it's more helpful and will be better off 99% of the time than those other cards. And it's just a quick, easy swap. The last one that in that category is Triarch Praetorian. Now, this does fall a little bit into that category of cards that we cut, like Drana and Alesha, but I cut 5 of those cards. And I think adding back 1, especially since this one is so ridiculous, when it enters from a graveyard, you draw 2 and you lose 2. That is huge bonus if we can get a counter on it.
It's just such good card advantage, and in general, Blitzflix was looking for a better ratio, so cutting 5 and just adding 1 is going to make that ratio and just those hands a lot smoother overall.
Yeah, we also are adding 2 more cards into this fodder category, those being Jury, Master of the Review, which is gets counters as things die, so when you sacrifice other things, he's going to get a counter, and now all he needs is 1 counter. You sacrifice him, you shoot down a creature. This is relevant removal for utility things early, and then he just comes right back, and you can do all of this stuff every single turn with Jury. Seems like a really good inclusion since he puts counters on himself. And the other one, Marionette Apprentice, enters with a counter. That's all. It just does all the work for you. That's already enough fodder for us.
It's so good. These cards work well in this deck. I love the fact that they fuel themselves and also will give you payoff that's just tangible to the game. Next, we also have the Meat Hook Massacre. Usually some people might think this is a super staple, but it works so well because not only can it function as a mini board wipe, if you have the mana to do it, your creatures are dying and you're being very proactive about it, which is the best home for this type of card.
Right, and now Blitzflix mentioned this is not a deck that wants to be attacking you all that often. You just sit there behind your wall of chump blockers and you just fling them at people and you sacrifice them to your Viscera Seer or your Woe Strider, and you just get the effect of whatever they enter or dive with every single turn. And the 3 we just mentioned, along with the next one, Uncivil Unrest, constitute this addition of win conditions that Blitzflix was missing. I think the deck was a little bit light on win cons of what to do when I'm just sitting here. And now with Jury and Marionette Apprentice chipping away at their life totals and their utility creatures, Meat Hook Massacres draining them down, Uncivil Unrest is just going to be additional direct damage, and it plus Sack Outlet totally enables everything we're doing.
Backup is usually not relevant, but Voldaren Thrillseeker is great in this deck because it comes with the 1/1 counter. You can lightning bolt people for the turn when you sack it, and then it'll just come back and you can do it all again. I love backup for this deck.
Yeah, I love it because if you have a way to make the Thrillseeker enter with counters aside from its own backup ability, you can throw that on something else, and this kind of serves as like a backup, pun intended, card for a sack outlet. If I don't have a Viscera Seer, I can just use this card by itself plus Marchesa. That's it. That's all I need, and I lightning bolt something every turn. That is also hard to come out from under when your opponents are trying to develop.
Threefold Thunderhulk is going to be one of the win cons in this deck. Beezy talks about him all the time, but I do admit he is great in here. He comes with multiple 1/1 counters. You're going to make a ton of low bodies when he enters, and because he has the counters, he's so good to sack and then just keep bringing back.
Yeah, like you throw a Jury or a Meat Hook into play when you have Threefold Thunderhulk, and now you just have 4 triggers on all of this stuff every turn. It's kind of going to change from I'm dirtling, I'm the threat, you better find an answer soon, to if you let me untap, if you let the game progress that I get 5 of these turns like this, you're dead.
And when we swapped out the swamp, we're putting in Lazotep Quarry. This is great because it's going to let you sacrifice stuff for mana, which is at instant speed too. So if you have something and you want to protect it from someone trying to kill it, and then it's like, okay, no, I'll kill it myself because I don't want it exiled, you can get it, get some mana, and maybe do something with that too.
Yeah, yet another backup in case we don't have a sack outlet. It can help you fuel those first couple turns and get to the point where you've just got a bunch of cards in your hand and you can't lose. The old average mana value of this deck was 2.74. We didn't really change that too much. The new average mana value is 2.77. This is a really low to the ground deck. It's why we're not upset having 2.5 to 3 lands in our opener, because this deck can work on 5 or so lands. It just has this engine that is so hard to disrupt. So we're pretty solid there. The price before we upgraded it was $322. Price after is $368, and I think half of that's Meat Hook Massacre. But I do think this deck looks a lot scarier now.
It looks a lot more synergistic, and with the old versus new average mana value, we were just thinking it's like you want a better ratio of win cons to fodder and that sort of thing. So even though it is a slight increase, it means the deck is going to function a lot more because you have more of those types of cards in your deck to begin with. The next deck we're going to move on to is Relictus's deck, and this is Zuladoc Void Gorger. This is an awesome colorless deck that I'm super excited to take a look at. Zuladoc is 5 colorless for a 7/4 with colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. That is so much power and just so much value on the field if you can get Zuladoc to stick.
Yeah, this is like the quintessential Zuladoc too. Every card you're thinking of is in here. It's got all of the Eldrazi Titans, Ulamog, Kozilek, Emrakul. Maybe I missed a few, but it's like every big giant Eldrazi, we're going to try to cascade Titans into Titans. Your opponents are never going to be able to win if you untap with Zuladoc and you get those triggers. I think the plan here totally makes sense, but getting targeted and losing ramp was something that Relictus noted for us, and I looked at this average mana value of the initial deck is 5.31. Just to put that into perspective with some stats, there were 14 spells in this deck costing 8 or more, and also 14 spells in this deck costing 2 or less. I don't think those should necessarily be the same. That's definitely favoring the high mana value. So I'm glad we got to take a look at it. And the other thing, only 35 lands.
Yeah, Relictus mentioned that this deck was very feast or famine. If he got going, then he'd be able to like stomp out the entire board immediately because he had all these gigantic Eldrazi. But if some ramp got like hurt or if Zuladoc couldn't stick, then he had all of these cards just kind of sitting in his hand. And I feel like that is a very big hallmark with Zuladoc decks to begin with.
Yeah, so we want to make it so that A, you don't need Zuladoc to function and your deck doesn't fold if he dies early or if your ramp spell dies early. You know, if they blow up your Thran Dynamo, we don't want you to be dead. So we want to make sure we're hitting land drops, consistently getting the mana to play our dudes, lower the curve, get Zuladoc going earlier, because also if we can get Zuladoc in play on turn 4 instead of turn 6, that just lessens the chances that they're going to want to kill it right away and not just develop themselves, or maybe they won't have a removal spell because it's earlier in the game. So we're definitely looking to see if we can cut out some of the higher mana value stuff, make room for lower early game plays to help power up all of that nonsense that we really want to get to.
The first couple cuts are going to be in the same category. These are Ring of Three Wishes and Skyship Weatherlight. These are types of tutors that come down, and they are a fair amount of mana to come down, and then you also have to pay mana into them to get the cards that you want. Skyship Weatherlight is also rough because it's going to be 1 out of 3 cards that you tutor also, so you never exactly know which one you're going to get.
Yeah, it definitely contributes to that feast or famine where, like, if you don't have the mana, you're just going to lose, but if you do have the mana, it feels great. Also, we're going to cut Horizon Stone. I don't think that this card is necessarily worth the initial 5 mana. I think you need some kind of way to offset how much mana you can make. And this deck feels so mana hungry that I really don't want to pass putting all of my hopes and dreams that the Horizon Stone with 6 mana under it stays until my next turn. And then Platinum Imperion is just a card I don't like as a finisher. Not even a finisher. It's like a big splashy play. I think it's too much of a lightning rod and not enough of a win the game card that it meets this awful Venn diagram of not getting the job done.
There are also some very big boys in here that I think we can cut, one of them being Blightsteel Colossus. If this isn't the definition of feast or famine, then I don't know what is. There's also Artisan of Kozilek too. I feel like these cards just don't do enough for the high mana cost that they are making you pay.
Yeah, not terrible, but like I said, we're comparing them against all the Titans. And I think that holds true for the next 2 cards, Bane of Balaged and Reality Smasher. I think these could work in a budget deck. But we've got 11 mana haymakers that say I win the game unless you answer it right now. I think these cards are definitely a step short of that. And so I think they're perfect to cut because we can make room and without compromising the core identity of the deck. Because, you know, Bane of Balaged was not the centerpiece of this deck.
Yeah, they are big boys and they are on theme. But also it's like we have big boys and they're a little bit better. Unwinding Clock is in here, and we can't really utilize our artifacts on other people's turns, so I'm not exactly sure why it's in here. And then also, Karn Liberated is one that we're going to be cutting. This is very expensive for a removal spell, and I think we could do just a touch better, even in colorless.
And Karn is like your quintessential, one of the reasons you don't like Planeswalkers as much, because while Karn does have a huge upside, you're gonna play him, you're gonna answer a threat, and then he's gonna die.
Yeah.
It's gonna feel not great.
I feel like Planeswalkers in general, as you guys may or may not know, are just so vulnerable not only to actual removal spells, but you could just attack them and they can die. And this is one of the reasons where I'm like, ugh, maybe I don't want to pay that much.
Exactly. But get ready to feast on some vegetables, because we are going to be adding some cards that I think will help cast Zul'Adok sooner and will help us be less crippled when Zul'Adok inevitably dies, whether or not we got a trigger out of him. Mind Stone, Liquimetal Torque, and the Iron Crag, 2 mana rocks that are just critical to get our feet under us and make it so that there are more combinations of hands that lead to a turn 4 Zul'Adok, so that we're not just mulliganing to Mana Vault or Soul Ring.
Warm Power Stone is also another vegetable card. Sure, it's not the most exciting, but if you want to ramp out your big boys, especially if Zul'Adok can't stick, because people would love to counter him, then you have to have more mana to be able to play them.
Yeah, I think that also ties into like why we're cutting Ring of Three Wishes and Skyship Weatherlight. It's nice to have all these tutors, but with such a high concentration of big giant monsters that are going to end the game in any number of combinations of ways, almost no matter which one we get, I think it's more important to just consistently power out one of them per game on turn 8. And that will be better than investing 4 mana and then 4 more mana just to get one of them into our hand. Glaring Fleshraker and Kozilek's Command are going to be ways to make Eldrazi spawn while also contributing a little bit more to the game. The Fleshraker is going to be pinging our opponents for some non-combat damage, and maybe chipping a player who's at 10 down to 0 before we have to waste all of our big giant monsters attacking them. And Kozilek's Command is just a nice little way to interact while holding up mana. It lets you pass the turn and surprise people. Go end step, 3 spawns. Didn't see that coming. Untap, Zul'Adok plus a 7-drop. Boom.
Even in colors, we can be looking at the mana base, though. Snow-Covered Waste came out in MH3, and it is a great way to amplify your, wait for it, Field of the Dead mana base, because you can still be making zombies with this colorless land. Did you know it's good?
Yes, and I think it's really crucial that we are adding lands. I think 35 is way too few for this deck, so I wanted to add at least 2, and maybe you could explore adding more, but as you'll see, the curve did lower, so we also have a little bit less requirements on the 8 drops. So I think adding 2 is good for now, but that's something I think you should playtest Relictus and then maybe revisit it. As for a big threat, I did want to add at least 1 Haymaker. So Rise of the Eldrazi seems great. It's an extra turn spell. It costs 7 or more. It does other stuff on it. I think it's going to absolutely snowball. Better than like an Artisan of Kozilek. I think it's a step above the cards we cut in that category and pretty much on par with the cards that we left in.
Liberator Urza's Battlethopter is also one that is just a shining star in all of the colorless decks, because flashing in an Eldrazi Titan is going to feel so good once you untap and just go, okay, I win now, guys.
Yeah, and I think another big play that this deck will be looking to make is get enough mana for Liberator plus Zul'Adok, so that you can flash in Zul'Adok on the end step, and you don't need 100 mana on your main phase. You can go, cool, front load 6 of it. No one was ready for that because I had the Battlethopter in my hand. Untap and easily play a 7, 8, or 9 drop with the other ramp that you have on board. And I think that's going to be one of the best ways to trigger Zul'Adok, just surprising it in.
But let's talk about average mana value, because I feel like that was one of the parts that was hurting the most in this deck. The average mana value before was 5.31. That is very large, even for a Cascade deck. But now the average mana value is 4.89. That's a lot less.
Yes, every spell you cast is now reduced by an average of 0.42 less mana, which is basically 1/2. It's like, oh, if there was a 6-drop in my hand before, it's basically cost 5.5 mana. I think that is a huge change. I don't know if we made it sound like the hugest change in the world, but when you play a game, all your spells just magically costing 0.5 less mana, or 0.4 less mana in this case, and you still have the same overarching game plan, and you still have the same best finishers, I think that's a huge upgrade. Now, we did change the number of lands in this deck, and that does change the number of average lands in the opening hand. Before it was 2.47. I think that's kind of unacceptable with what our game plan is and what kind of monsters we need to power out, or else they're going to be rotting away. We upped it a little. It's now 2.67, so it's closer to 3 than it was to 2. I think that's definitely still something to play with. We added a little bit, but you can definitely change it. And how do we even see that, Mia?
We can actually see it on Moxfield.com, the best place online to both build a deck and analyze a deck. If you go to Moxfield, you can actually see the audits that we made on our NN deck audit list. You can see the unchanged ones, and then you can see what we changed and compare them and all the stats with them.
Thanks, Moxfield. If you're not using Moxfield, you're falling behind. But now I get to rip into Mia's personal deck. It's always fun to nitpick a fellow nitpicker. And Mia, why don't you just introduce what your commander's deck is, the game plan, and some notes you had on it.
Sure, this is one of my babies, but it has fallen to the wayside because I feel like it's a little bit slow and it's not as efficient as it could be. This is my Ramos Dragon Engine 5-color deck that has Door to Nothingness as the win con. Ramos says whenever you cast a spell, put a 1/1 counter on it for each of the spell's colors. Remove 5 1/1 counters on it and you add double Wooburg, but only once each turn. This is very convenient because Door to Nothingness has a double Wooburg cost to activate to make someone lose the game.
It was made to be.
Yes, so I wanted to find the Door to Nothingness and either ramp or use Ramos to generate enough mana to kill people with its ability, whether that's copying the trigger of Door or getting it back from the graveyard. It doesn't really matter to me. I just want this to be like a very fun and flashy and very telegraphed way to win because I think Door to Nothingness is a very awesome card. However, this deck is very slow because getting all of that mana, ramping it out, and then finding the door is just a very slow process in time. There's also no real strong secondary win con. My next win con is like beating people to death in the air with Ramos, and that is not a great or steady win con.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted to do when looking at this deck to maybe rehabilitate it a little bit was increase the number of artifacts, since this is an artifact-centric deck, and all of the cards that say search for an artifact are now, increased level of toolboxiness, is that a word? And I also wanted to add the number of colors, up the number of colors in the deck for Ramos, so that a spell on average puts more counters on Ramos. So some of the cuts I made are going to be like slower artifacts. Artifacts I think are sort of like tangential to the main plan. First, I wanted to cut Lithoform Engine and Mizium Transweliquat, which is the weirdest name. I don't know what that is, but I cut it. I think these are ways to ideally get more door triggers or more door copies in play, but I think ultimately they're way too much mana for what you have to spend on them. And I think that they are good in more of the magical Christmas land scenarios.
That is completely fair. I think that getting doors already hard enough. It's hard to copy those triggers. And I feel like a lot of ways to copy triggers are very expensive ways.
Yeah, Transweliquat is a 3 mana investment and then 3 more mana to copy something that needs to already be in play. And so we're just going to say forget it. This was half BM, half actual cut. I cut Tail's End. I think when you're a Wooburg deck, this is not a counterspell that is going to crack into playability for me. I think if you really want to counterspell, there's other stuff, but I just kind of ended up trimming this from the deck.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out that with this deck, I didn't want this super high powered, super, tutor the door on turn 2, get it turn 3, with force of will, mana drain type of thing. I want it to be a little bit jankier, a little bit more fun, but not this janky, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the other thing too that was what you wanted to do with the deck is not just make infinite mana on turn 3 with Basalt Monolith and Rings of Bright Earth, and then play a way to make colored mana and then just go get door. That's not what we're interested in at all. So that's something to consider as well. It's not make this CEDH. It's no, this is jank and it's crappy, but let's make it actually win some games and function a little bit better. Something else I cut was Tezzeret Artifice Master. I think there maybe is an argument for the other Tezzeret that can search for artifacts, including the door, and put it in play. But this one I just trimmed for now because I think it's too slow and it suffers from Planeswalker Sorcery Syndrome.
Yeah, I feel like this deck had sort of an identity crisis because there was a time where this was a little bit more powerful. I like Mind Over Matter in here and Rhystic Study and that sort, but I felt like those cards were too powerful. And so I want something a little less powerful. And what's the least powerful thing I can do? Oh, obviously put Planeswalkers in, and I need some card draw.
Yeah, I think we can find a middle ground here. The other 2 cards I cut were Whirler Rogue and Blind Obedience. I think you just love Blind Obedience too much, and you put it in the deck, even though it doesn't really synergize with anything. It's never going to be bad, but it can be cut for an artifact or a card with more colors. And then Whirler Rogue is kind of on theme, but ultimately I trimmed it because I think Plan A is door, and this doesn't really help.
That's fair.
Another card I trimmed was Thopter Spy Network, and I think this it falls into the Whirler Rogue category of if you're beating down and you have a bunch of evasive flyers, it's good to draw cards and it'll make jump blockers and stuff. I don't think this deck does that enough, so I did trim it. And Filigree Sages, this was always a weird card, actually. Every time you played it, I would go, that's a weird one, because this deck has Timeless Lotus in it. And spoiler alert, I didn't cut that card, because it's pretty okay, especially when you're tapping and untapping stuff. So this card either combos with Timeless Lotus, or does absolutely nothing, at least from what I've seen. So I said, get out of here.
Yeah, I think that I was never actively looking to combo. Sometimes you accidentally make infinite mana, but when your deck has so many colors and you can never get the blue from Filigree Sages, from Timeless Lotus, then it's a little bit harder. Like the infinite mana combo when there's no sinks and stuff is a little bit less scary, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, lastly, I trimmed Farseek and Ignoble Hierarch. There's still some ramp like this left, but I can only make 10 changes, so I wanted to just, hit a few points in each category, and this deck can always be revisited later, but I think I wanted to either cut these for artifact ramps that just don't have any colors, or find a way to ramp but with more colors so that Ramos is more of a threat when he's in play. I've definitely seen, turns where you untap with Ramos, but you don't get the 5 counters on him. And I think I want to mitigate that completely. I want it to be like, if you untap with Ramos, you are guaranteed to have 10 mana, and then from there you can make a really big step towards getting Door.
That's fair. So what would you add?
Well, for starters, to replace those 2 ramp cards I just cut, I added Kiora's Follower, which is perfect because it can untap the Door in a late game scenario, but it also is 2 colors and it's just ramp. So I felt like that was great. And Planar Genesis is another one. We can dig for the Door, but mostly in the early game, it just is a Farseek copy, but it's got 2 colors, so it's twice as good with Ramos. We only need to hit 5 counters on Ramos. So if he was like 10, this wouldn't be that much of a difference going from 1 to 2. But it's 5, it's double, it's 40% instead of 20%.
Yeah, I feel like I had Kuro's Follower in here at one point, but unfortunately it was more of a matter of I was worried about creature-based ramp in the artifact deck.
Yeah, I think another thing that this deck was lacking a little bit was card draw, and I think that struggling to find Door can be mitigated, not necessarily by tutors, but just with card draw. Playing the game will let you play more game, which will let you find more cards, which will just sort of get you to the Door eventually, or get you to a tutor. It definitely works that way too. Ethereum Sculptor, I think, was just a no-brainer for this deck. As we increase artifacts, it's good to have some that have colors. It works for Ramos instead of, if it was just like Foundry Inspector, that doesn't work for Ramos. This is kind of like a nice middle ground. This deck already does have Enthusiastic Mechanaut, which is just like the perfect card. So this is slightly less colors, just a copy of that effect. Also, Sicarian Infiltrator, I love the card, and it's perfect, and it makes a bunch of dudes, a bunch of chump blockers, and did I mention I love it?
I have not touched this deck in a while, and that card was not that popular when I last visited this deck, so I'm very excited to play that.
You can go over the next one, because you love this card.
Oh, Illustrious Wanderglyph is in here. That's going to make so many artifacts, and it's going to be a board. This can actually be a board in a can, and because of the fact that it kind of fuels itself to its Ascend trigger, then maybe I can actually swing in and beat people with it.
Yeah, and I'm going to go even harder on the card draw here. I have Forensic Gadgeteer, which is going to make a bunch of artifacts or clues whenever you cast artifacts, which lets you draw cards, which just helps you churn through your deck. Chrome Courier, 2-colored artifact that replaces itself. Perfect before Ramos to set up, perfect after to get those counters. And Thought Monitor, colored artifact card draw. Get in here. I think in a perfect world, I would add the other ones that do the similar things like Thoughtcast and stuff. But for now, I want an artifact, and I want to pick the best one.
Also, I might just add things as Aether Drift comes out because there are some cool cards coming out in that set.
Yeah, and there are, and I think to go along with Forensic Gadgeteer and Illustrious Wanderglyph making dudes, Koldatha Forge Master is a 5-mana investment, yes. But once you get the fodder, it's an instant speed, free way to get the Door into place, and you can easily do things like trigger Ramos, use Forge Master, sacrifice even relevant things, put the Door in play, untap it with the Kiora's Follower, boom, win the game, or boom, kill someone. We're not quite at win yet. This deck is janky, but yes, that will help get the game plan moving. And lastly, Brea's Apprentice, card draw, colored artifact.
I'm definitely excited to see where all these changes leave the deck and where I want to change it after all of these changes are made.
Yeah, in case you're wondering, the average number of lands in the opener, which I have not changed, is 2.55. I think that's okay. Maybe in the future that's something to look at. Average mana value before was 3.03. Average mana value after was 3.09. That's basically the same. I didn't really change that too much, but what I did change was I wanted to look at the cuts and the adds, and I wanted to, at the end of this, have more artifacts in the deck and have more colors in the deck. So there are now +4 artifacts. There are 4 more artifacts than when I started, and there are 4 more colors in the deck than when I started. So now Ramos will trigger just that much more often, and your things like Forensic Gadgeteer and Koldatha Forge Master will be that much more relevant.
I'm excited to see how this goes, but the next deck that we're actually going to look at is yours. So if you want to introduce that, let's get started.
Oh yeah, it's my turn. I've had this deck forever. It's one of my oldest decks, and I haven't been playing it a ton recently. It's my Brutaclad Telcor Engineer deck. 4 blue-red for a 4/4 creature tokens you control have haste. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you get a 2/1 blue Phyrexian Mirror, and then you can choose a token you control and have all of your tokens become that token, which is sweet. The game plan is to make a bunch of useless tokens that are easy to make, and then have one really difficult or impressive token that scales really well. Use Bruticlad, turn everything into that, and make a gigantic swing. I also wanted to be a little bit janky intentionally. I wanted to power this deck down. I'm not trying to play like Mox Opal and stuff. So I'm looking at things like Portal to Phyrexia or Staff of Nin. If I can make token copies of those with other spells and then make like 30 of them, that's just hilarious. That's a really goofy way to win. I have killed people with like 7 Staff of Nins before, but the deck does need to run more smoothly. I feel like sometimes I miss on card draw, and I think I just wanted to keep the identity of having a few wacky things. So whether or not that means you add more and cut some of the ones I have, or just keep it the same, at least it has that wacky identity.
No, I completely agree. I think that is a very cool win con for this. But one of the first things I noticed about this deck is that everything's like 6 mana. It's either a Bauble or it's 6 mana.
Yeah.
And that is a bad rate to be in. And
Honestly.
I feel like there are a lot of times in the game where you'll be like, okay, Bauble, Wayfarer's Bauble, and then you'll sit there for like 3 turns and you're like, well, I'm not sure what to make a copy of next. So
Yeah, or I'm shipping hands that have like 6 drops in them because I can't do anything with them.
So when I went to cuts, I want to cut a lot of the things that were a ton of mana. The first being Astral Dragon. You want to make copies, but this is a very expensive way to make the copies, and with the new sets that have come out lately, there have been a lot more cheap ways to make them. Also, Elminster's Simulacrum, that is another one where it's like, these are very expensive copies, and it also relies on your opponents to be having good cards that you want to copy. I mean, you don't want to be using this on like a couple of mana dorks.
I have been more impressed with Elminster's Simulacrum than Astral Dragon. Astral Dragon, I think, oh man, it really bums me out that the tokens are creatures. A lot of times you do all this work and then they get board wiped and it's like, what did I spend 8 mana on?
Yeah, 8 mana is a lot to be spending, especially in Izzet where ramp is not that plentiful.
Yeah, I also see you cut Ugin the Ineffable, and this is probably a good move. Sometimes you gotta kill your darlings, and I think this is one of the reasons and one of the ways where having an outside opinion can really help you improve your deck, because I just love cost reducers. I love cost reducers way too much. I had a deck in the past that was just all of them, and it was so much fun. And I think I'm having rose-colored glasses for Ugin. I think it's 6 mana investment. I'm not getting enough payoff off of the 2 reduction. I'm not comboing. I'm not casting 8 spells right away. I'm just going, oh boy, this sure does feel good. So I think if you need a deck rehabilitated, this is a great place to do it because we're very objective. Mia's going to roast me for playing Ugin.
I think it's just the fact that when I think of cost reducers, I think of it like ramp. And if you said, I'm going to pay 6 mana for 2 ramp, I think that is an awful trade-off.
Yeah, I think maybe if I had more cards that were like 2 mana and then they drew cards and replaced themselves so I could have like some kind of storm turn.
Yeah.
I don't have that.
The next one is going to be Bitterthorn Nissa's Animus. I think this is a very cool artifact, but it's expensive to get it on, and then you also have to be attacking pretty consistently. And then there's also only 4 to 6 basics depending on whether you are looking at the cut version or the uncut version. And because of that, it's just you can only use this a few times, especially if you've drawn a couple of them to begin with.
Yeah, my basic count was pretty low. I probably shouldn't have been playing this. Also, you cut one of my babies. Salvaging Station? But this brings back Baubles.
Yeah, there's only 8 Baubles in the deck. There's
But you
only
only
8
need 1.
cards that it triggers with.
But you only need 1.
How much mana is Salvaging Station?
It's only 6. If you
is-
reduce it with Ugin, it's only 4.
This is what I mean. Ugin's gone, and all of these 6+ mana cards need to leave too.
Look, if Salvaging Station happens to find a way back in the deck in 6 months, just know that it wasn't my fault.
Okay, and if your win percentage seems to go down too, just know that that's not my fault.
Yeah. But Astral Dragon and Ugin, they're not going to be back here.
The next ones are Snow-Covered Mountain and Snow-Covered Island. These aren't bad cards, but there are better lands that have come out, especially for artifact decks, that I am very excited to be putting in.
Yeah, I think part of my mistake, maybe necessarily, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I was playing too many basics. And then I had also cards that search basics, so you kind of just trim that whole package.
Yeah, there's also Care's Keep too. I mean, there are lands that make tokens, and that is a good thing for that. But there are better lands that make tokens. Super excited to get to that piece too. Also, Summoning Station. Again, another giant mana artifact that just makes little artifacts, but you're putting so much mana in to get something so little out of it.
And just to be fair, this is not even in my own defense, but the tokens are not artifacts that it makes.
Oh, that's even worse.
Yeah.
And then Prototype Portal. This is 4 mana, and then you exile a card, and then you can pay mana into it based on that card's casting cost to be able to make a copy of it. I mean, there are good ways to make copies, but this feels like it's too many steps. It's like set up, get it, and then if they kill it beforehand, you just exile the card you want to make a copy of.
I'll tell you what this is. This card is really, really good if you can imprint an artifact land, because then it just says tap, make a land. And token lands are just as hard to kill as non-token lands. I thought that was so cool. This card is absolutely unusable in any other scenario, and there have been times where I have to miss a land drop to play it. So I totally understand. I'm realizing all my darlings are not going to survive.
That's okay, but I did keep in things that you
Yeah,
really
you better
like.
add some cool stuff.
Portal to Phyrexia is still in here. Staff of Nint's still in here, so you can still make copies. But some of the ads are going to be cheaper, and it's going to be better, too. Because one of them is Saheeli, the Sun's Brilliance. This came out in LCI, and she makes artifact tokens, and it's repeatable, and it's only 2 mana to come down and 2 mana to copy it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely usable. You also added Season of Weaving. This can make copies, so it's kind of like in replacement of the Elminster Simulacrum. I'm going to copy my own stuff as opposed to hoping they have other stuff.
Yeah, and there's also card draw, and you can mega bounce things as a finisher if you just have a bunch of tokens.
I probably will be saying Mega Bounce when I do that.
You could definitely do that. Also, when we're getting to lands, there's things like Fomori Vault and Fountain Port. These care about artifacts for Fomori Vault, and for Fountain Port, you're making tokens to begin with. You can sack those for card draw, or you can be making tokens with it if you have a little bit of extra mana and you really need those tokens to just sit out on the field.
Yeah, you also added Archway of Innovation.
Yeah, I think that's really great because you're going to be able to use those things like your baubles to actually improvise your spells.
Ooh, tapping Mishra's Bauble for mana. That is a play that I would like to make.
That's a dream of yours. We're also going to Glimpse the Impossible, even though this is usually not seen outside of red decks in general because of the card advantage. This does provide card advantage, and it also gives you 2 bodies if you leave those cards in exile, which can really help with the Brutaclad like token triggers.
Yeah, so there's worlds where I have enough cards and I just go 3 mana, make 3 tokens, build up the next turn.
Yeah, I think that can be a really versatile way to use the deck. There's also Patim in here. You did need some card draw, but giving everything hexproof because 39 out of your 100 cards are hexproof, and it's not like people are going to be looking at your lands to begin with. That is a big portion of your deck, including your commander, which is a lot of mana to recast.
Yeah, that's the huge inflection point. Every time I play Brutaclad is like, if you have a kill spell, you need to use it, or you're probably dead. And a lot of people know that because I have 3 constructs in play and 7 servos. So it's very obvious that my next move is play Brutaclad, fingers crossed, hope I can get 25 constructs. And players know they have to remove it. So I guess putting down like sort of a lightning rod, but like a stopgap for that, where it's like, no, you don't get to do this until Padim's off the field. And then if I have counter magic, it makes it even harder. So I don't love Padim as a card, but I feel like with Brutaclad alone, it makes a lot of sense. Because even something like Lightning Greaves, that doesn't solve my problem. I would still have the inflection point of equipping to Brutaclad, and then they use their removals. Like, it doesn't actually help me. I need it to already have hexproof when I play it.
Plus, with things in here like Wormcoil Engine and Portal to Phyrexia, there's a very high chance that your artifacts are going to be the most, like the highest mana value of them. So you're going to be getting those cards more consistently than like anyone else. There's also Drafna, founder of Latinam, in here because he can bounce your artifacts to save them, like Brutaclad, for instance, by just keeping up a couple mana. Or you can copy your artifacts and then make tokens of them, and that gives you a cheaper way to make the tokens.
I could even copy Mishra's Bauble?
You could copy Mishra's Bauble. Very expensive, but still.
Turn all my tokens into Bauble. Sack my whole board.
It could profit.
It's the fanciest way to concede I've ever imagined. What else did we add? Thopter Spy Network. I cut that from your deck.
Yeah, but I think he's really great in here because you have a lot of tokens that you can ping in, and you did need card draw. And I feel like that this is just a really good way to do a little bit of both. There's also 3 steps ahead in here because you can copy, you can counter, or you can just have a little bit of card selection. I feel like all of those things are really helpful for your deck.
Yeah, I really hate cancel, and I think I have to get this card out of that category because I think Disallow is terrible. But I think this is much different and has much higher upside than a Disallow. I think the upside of Disallow is basically cancel.
I mean,
but this copying a thing, triggering something, or even filtering cards in the late game when I have a bunch of mana, feels relevant to me.
I feel like this is a more versatile thing of like Sublime Epiphany. That's where my head is at with it.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, because when you have extra mana, it's the same kind of blowout.
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot more cheap ways to be making copies than like 8 mana Astral Dragon. And then with your lower curve, and like you can just make these copies and make a more consistent board and keep Brutaclad out longer.
Do I have Sublime Epiphany in this deck too?
I don't remember. I'll have to check that later.
I'm probably going to cut it if it's still in there. So yeah, you definitely tried to lower the curve. It looks like I did have a lot of cards that cost 4+.
Yeah, so the average mana value before is 3.62, and the average mana value now is 3.35.
Jeez, I didn't even realize it was that different.
Yeah, that's a pretty big curve. And now you actually have a perfect Field of the Dead mana base because there's only 1 of each land in your entire deck.
Yeah, I think those snow lands were duplicates.
Yeah, they were.
Now I have 4 instead of 6 before. Well, I'll never miss on a Field of the Dead trigger, which always make me happy. Huge thank you to our patrons. This show is not possible without them. There are still limited slots left if you want to join and become a patron and get your decks on this show every month. That's an option that's available to you. Maybe now our decks will suck a little bit less, but if you want to watch more Nitpicking Nerds, Aether Drift Precons, they're here, and should you buy them, and are they good? Find out.